Wide gains in Asian markets today as investors held out hope ahead of China-US trade talks that are scheduled for later this week. A positive return to Chinese markets also spilt out to other markets. Now, mainland stocks resuming trade today after a week-long holiday. Investors unfazed by news that Washington added 8 Chinese tech giants and 28 other firms on a blacklist, with both the Shanghai and the Shenzhen composite up at the end of today's trade, both of them up around 0.2%. Now, over in Hong Kong, the Hang Seng also seeing similar gains. Pharmaceuticals among the gainers of the day, CSPC as well as Sino Biopharmaceuticals up 6.9% and 2.8% respectively. Meantime, rail operator MTR Core, which has seen very heavy losses amid the city's protests, was up in earlier trade. It ended a touchdown, though, today down some 0.11%. In Japan, the benchmark Nikkei and the broader topics, they both bounced back today. Exporters, including Toyota Motor and IHI Core, saw some impressive gains as well. Over in South Korea, meantime, shares also climbing today. The Kospi adding some 1.2% in trade, while Samsung Electronics, their stock rallied 2.4% after it forecast better than expected profit. Hanwha Aerospace, meantime, closing 4.4% firmer on bets that it would take advantage of the US-imposed Chinese tech ban. Now, to get an insight on the reaction from the markets today, we have Ross Feingold. He's Asia Political Risk Analyst, joining us. Ross, could you give us more clarity on why we're seeing this reaction, this muted reaction from markets in Asia today? Investors seemingly unfazed by the news on Washington blacklisting those Chinese tech giants and other Chinese entities.
Well, several of these companies are unlisted, so they're not going to have a large impact on the markets. And then to the extent that some of the companies are listed on markets in Hong Kong or in China, they have a very large China business, not necessarily a large overseas business. Their supply chains might predominantly be in China as well, so they're not necessarily impacted by a U.S. decision that would restrict the ability of American companies to transact with these companies. And some of this may have been factored in earlier as well, given the overall U.S.-China relationship, actions that were previously taken against ZTE and subsequently Huawei. So investors, they may have factored this in earlier. The supply chain, the companies, they may have adjusted their supply chains as well to rely more on domestically sourced components. So from a variety of perspectives, it wasn't really a surprise. And frankly, these kinds of announcements against Chinese companies are probably going to happen again in the future.
Let's look a little at the nature of this, Ross. I mean, these blacklisted firms, Hikvision, SenseTime, for example, they're pretty high-profile tech superstars in China. China's already signaled that it will hit back. What does this mean for the China-US trade talks that are scheduled later this week?
Well, certainly it's going to come up in the discussion. In the United States, at least from the official announcements made by the Commerce Department, have indicated that this is not linked to the trade talks. And I think we should take them at their word. That is, human rights concerns in China generally, in Xinjiang specifically, has certainly been something that has attracted much attention from the U.S. government, as whether it's the White House, the State Department, U.S. government agencies, as well as Congress, from both Democrats and Republicans. So the Chinese side might bring this up from their perspective and say, well, now it's going to be part of a back and forth bargaining. And the U.S. side is going to say, no, it's unrelated. The reality is, again, the U.S. will probably take these kinds of actions irrespective of what kind of trade negotiations are ongoing or what kind of trade agreements are reached. And that means there's a very high likelihood of retaliatory action by China against U.S. companies, again, regardless of trade negotiations or what kind of agreements the U.S. and China might reach over trade.
Well, investors would have probably hoped that there might be something of a mini deal at least this week, Ross. But President Trump has said it's unlikely for both parties to come to an agreement from this round of trade talks. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, clearly the administration and President Trump, they want to manage expectations. We know from earlier this year, there were several times when it seemed like an agreement was imminent, and ultimately there was no agreement. And in fact, the relationship deteriorated specifically with regard to trade issues subsequent to that earlier optimism that an agreement was imminent. So there's some expectations management, and of course it's related to the U.S. presidential election cycle, which is now moving into a phase where people will be voting in the Democrat primary soon, and then a year from now will be election day. So presidential politics are a factor, and President Trump doesn't want to be humiliated by talking up the potential or the likelihood of a deal for a deal not to happen. So he wants to avoid that, and that's understandable as well. So he's setting expectations for the public, for the media, and even for the Chinese negotiators as well. And we should keep that in mind. He's indicating that the U.S. is not going to just give things away in this round. And in fact, the U.S. might have some give and take with China, but the U.S. is not going to be that quick to reach a deal. So there's some messaging to the Chinese government as well when President Trump publicly says that there's a low likelihood of a deal this week.
All right, Ross, thank you very much for that.